We are very glad today to have here Professor John Westcott, a living legend of IFAC and control science. And we would like to have some of his recollections about the early days of IFAC. So my first question is the impressions on the foundation of IFAC in 1956 with the famous meeting in Heidelberg.
Yes, well, the conference had been advertised as of interest to overseas people, and I had submitted a paper, but I hadn't expected to be there. As a young lecturer, I had committed myself to a month's consulting with the Royal Dutch Shell in their research station in Delft. And when I got there, I explained this to the head of the group there. They were concerned with the control of distillation columns, which is a tricky business. And he said, oh, I'd like to go to that conference. I'll borrow a car from the company and I invite you to join me. So I was very pleased to do that. So in a way, it was almost an accident that I was at that conference. Mm-hmm. When we got there, we were surprised to find this group of Russians, Sipkin and Leftov and the rest. And it was the first time that they had come out to a conference in the West. And we were surprised to find they weren't monsters, they were really bright, sharp chaps like ourselves. So this gave a great buzz to the conference. So when we got to the Thursday at the banquet, an American called Rufus Oldenburger said, we ought to form an international federation. I'll draw up a charter and you all sign it. Well, some people were a little nervous about this, but we thought, well, you know, it's all harmless, so we cheerfully signed, never dreaming what would follow from it. We should have been more respectful, really, because look how it is now. Anyway, the next day he produced the thing and we signed it. And 3 weeks after the conference, he sent me his view of the Constitution, this horrible blue reproduction process that was the only thing you could do in those days. And that, of course, was much modified. There was another conference in Germany, in Düsseldorf, where it was made more modified. And then finally it was finalized in Paris. Now in those days, in the early days of IFAC, if you wanted to be successful, you had to be a gifted linguist. And Professor Broider of France had all, had all the official IFAC languages, you could speak them all. So he was very necessary, really, to push this through to a successful conclusion. So finally in Paris in 1957, in September, we had a formal constitution for IFAC. And it was agreed that the first president should be an American, Harold Chestnut, the author of the text of the time, Chestnut and Mayer. And the venue would be in Moscow, under the leadership of Letov. And so there we were. The Constitution now existed. Now, just before we went to the Congress, there was a diplomatic incident where an American U-2 spy plane was shot down and the pilot was captured. And we were a little bit nervous about this, as you might imagine. But come the September, we all got there all right. And it was really a splendid occasion. 1,100 delegates, half of them Russian, it's true, but the rest from all over the world. And the preprints, 280 papers, about 3 inches thick, weighing about 5 kilograms. Fortunately, they gave us bags to carry them around, but we had to lug these around for the 5 days. And of course, with 10 parallel sessions, it was only possible to do at most a tenth of the, but even with that sort of thing, it was clear that as far as the Russians were concerned, automatic control was a serious subject. And they, to our surprise, they had, we were really getting the latest work from Russia, which had obviously been backed up by a lot of previous work which we hadn't known about. So it was rather overwhelming, really. But however, it was, even from the small bit that you could attend, it was clear that a big step forward was imminent for automatic control. And so there was quite an excitement about this. In fact, you might even say a panic, because it was felt that the chap who was going to get there first would get all the rewards. So there was some excitement about that. The sort of topic of the time was adaptive systems. A remarkably high proportion of the papers had something to say about it. And the coverage covered the whole gamut from pure theory to crossbred practice. And the nagging thing that overhung the whole thing was, were these systems going to be economically viable? You know, that early stage, nobody knew. But there was somehow a feeling that the rewards were going to be very great, and whoever got there first would get them. So there was a sense of urgency about it, I think, which was very nice. I must say that the arrangement the Russians made for us were very, very nice indeed. They allowed us to go to the ballet, and they took us on a tour of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin, I've never seen so much gold leaf in my life before. It was in splendid state, it really was. Then after the conference, there came the visits. And this is where I think in the West we thought, you know, we're going to have great difficulty in ever matching this. Because they took us to the main institute in Moscow, to the another one in Leningrad, and a third one in Kiev. In Moscow, it's difficult to give a balanced view of the Institute of Automation and Telemechanics, which after all was the premium research scheme in the Soviet Union. And even after sort of a week of learning to not judge things by what they seemed, it still seemed to us remarkable that this was the Freeman Institute. It was, from our point of view, it looked more like a workshop than a research institute. And I suppose the reason was that, well, Trapeznikov, who was the head of the thing, gave us an introduction, and he invited us to discuss our work with his staff, and also to make criticisms if we felt they were justified. Now, this business of the criticisms, we found very awkward, really. We weren't accustomed to this, and it required more diplomacy than we were used to, I think. So the net result was we said very little. After that, the director invited us to ask questions. And this was a very important phase of the visit, because you had the chance. It seemed to be an axiom in Soviet Russia that if you never gave information unless it was asked for. So the thing to do was to ask the right question, and it could be very revealing if you got it right. And I think at the Institute of Automation and Telemechanics, we did quite well, because by the time we left the director's office, we knew that they had scientific staff of 400, that they had 10 main groups headed by a significant research person who was a known expert in the particular region. And they had 25 interpreters who would scour the world's publications in any given subject, which explained why they knew all about our work, whereas we had hardly any idea of theirs. They did say that we also, I think it was very difficult to get stuff done outside. So they said that, well, we do have a few mechanics. In fact, of course, in any one laboratory, They had draftswomen and wirers and everybody all together. And that's why I think we had a rather curious impression to us, because we weren't used to this. But by the end of the tour, we had a better appreciation of what was going on. We asked them about finances, and they said, in a planned institution, this is no problem. So we asked them about the building, and they said, oh, well, the government will provide a new building when it's justified. But they gave us to understand that that would be pretty soon now. Of the 10 research sections, I won't describe them all, but there were two which were quite interesting. There was, under Professor Eiserman, there was a laboratory which specialized in hydraulic and pneumatic systems. They took the view that these were more reliable than the electronic ones, and the time scale that was appropriate for process control, that this was the best thing. So that was quite interesting. The other one, which I will mention, is Professor Feldbaum had a laboratory which was concerned with extreme wind regulators. He had one which leapt to its optimum in 8 steps. We weren't very impressed by that because there was no dynamics in it. But they waved an arm to some bigger boxes, which they said were suitable for optimizing on 5 variables or 10 variables or even 12 variables. The next visit was Leningrad, City of Light, a recognizably European city. And the people were more relaxed, I think, than in Moscow. The Institute of Electromechanics was concerned for about half of its work on the control of telescopes, so City of Light again. The director explained to us that the main business was concerned with electric transmission and distribution, and they had a wide selection of automatic devices for this work. They took us into the laboratory where the telescope work was developed, and they said that they did the design, and then when the design was complete, they put it out. They showed us some examples of the work that had been put out, and I must say they had our sympathies. There obviously were problems with that. The next visit, oh yes, was Kiev. That involved flying, through Aeroflot, and we were a bit embarrassed because the scheduling scheme, I think, with Aeroflot is a bit haphazard. So when we arrived there, some unfortunate citizens were just flung out of the flight to make space for us as the VIPs. But there we are. In Kiev, it had been very much destroyed during the war and was being rebuilt. And the atmosphere there was entirely different. The people were friendly, just as if they'd been moved into a new housing estate. And in fact, the premises also were relatively new. In fact, it was the nearest thing we saw to what we would regard as normal, except that once more they had what they described as a few mechanics, but really rather a lot of mechanics by our standard, to sort of make special equipment. They said that they specialized in complex automation. So we had to ask them what that was. Well, that meant the automating of complete plants. So we said, well, how did they get their problems? They said, oh, they were provided by the users. And they took us around what they called the demonstration laboratories, where they had, it was like a sales office. They had one show what you could have. And they said that once a user had committed himself to have an installation, then the institute set up a laboratory in their factory, and the whole thing was organized from that, and they stayed there until it was done. And that's I think that the attitude of the people in the Ukraine is not Russia, if you see what I mean. And they were different. I mean, the director, for example, moved freely among his people and treated them as equals, which was unusual. And there did seem to be a sort of more relaxed atmosphere about the place somehow. So, oh yes, they had surprised us too, but when we arrived there, they issued us all with white overalls for going around the institute. And so after we came back, we had to go through the criticisms, which we didn't say very much about. And then he invited his staff to ask us some questions, which they pitched in and did with gusto, I must say. By this, timing is not a Russian speciality, and it was getting pretty late. I think it was about 3 o'clock by now, and we were beginning to feel a little limp. So then we came to the final ceremony, which was the taking of the photograph on the steps of the institution and the returning of the overalls. And then back to Moscow. Back to Moscow because Moscow was the only eye through which you could leave and take access to the external world, if it actually existed. But fortunately for us, it did, and so home.
Okay. So now I know that you have been studying for some time at MIT after the war. So can you tell us something about that period?
Yes, that was very fortunate. I was very lucky there. Well, the thing was, the wartime really messed up one's education because everything was so different. And I decided after the war I really needed to get educated properly, and that's why I came to Imperial College. And I had the good fortune to be invited as a guest of the Institute, which is almost a staff position, even though I was just an undergraduate. When I had a scholarship from the Institute of Electrical Engineers, which would provide me with £500. And in those days, converting £500 became $2,000. A bit different today. Anyway, when I finally got to MIT, I was given an interview by the dean, and I thought, that I wasn't looking forward to it. I thought, he would quiz me about my technical knowledge and so on. Mm-hmm. But oh no, not at all. First thing he said was, how much money have you got? So I said, $2,000. And he said, you'll have to be careful. In fact, since they gave me a free place in their graduate accommodation, I was able to manage, and they were very generous anyway. But the great thing about it was, being just after the war, all this sort of concealed work that had been kept secret was now being revealed. So it was a very good time to be there. And some quite famous people were there. And I had the advantage too that although I could take courses, for example, I took a course on Wiener's filtering, I didn't have to be quizzed about them. I was just allowed to drift on, whereas the normal students had to be rather serious about it all. And so that was excellent. But even so, I had quite considerable trouble in keeping up with these Americans who had all been so well fed, because during the wartime you weren't very well fed. So occasionally I had to sort of retire and recover and go back into action again. I met some quite famous people there, people like Truxall and Jimmy Ham, and it really was most fortunate to be there just at that time. The two people who ran the control side were Gordon Brown and Campbell, the Brown and Campbell text, were very famous then. Yes, I had the good fortune to make the acquaintance of Norbert Wiener, who seemed to like Englishmen, and he allowed me to see the text of his book called Cybernetics before it was published. So when I got back to England, I gave a lecture on cybernetics and nobody knew what it was. So I was ahead of the market in a way, really. That was very lucky.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Just a last word. Do you have some Do you remember Giorgio Quazza? Do you remember
Oh,
him?
yes.
Just a few words on him, his personality?
Oh, yes. In fact, well, he was a very nice man, I must say, and I enjoyed his company very much. And it was really very sad when he was lost on that climb.
Yes.
I was very sad about that.
It was 78. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Westcott. See you maybe at the Congress if you are still, well, I still hope you can be there.
Oh, well,
okay?
of course.
If you will be welcome. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.